Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Controlling Apple Scab and Powdery Mildew in Your Orchard, presented by Valent USA. I'm Robin Sitberg of Meister Media Worldwide, publisher of American Fruit Grower Magazine, and I'll be moderating the webinar today. But before we begin, I'd like to introduce today's speakers. Jill Calabro is the Product Development Manager for Fungicides at Valent USA, and she's worked in the agriculture sector for almost 20 years. She earned her bachelor's degree in horticulture from Iowa State University, her master's in plant pathology from the University of Minnesota, and her doctorate in plant pathology from Oregon State University. Greg Clark is Senior Field Market Development Specialist for Valent USA, and he's based in Pennsylvania, and he has master's and doctorate degrees in plant pathology from Pennsylvania State University. He's also worked for Abbott Laboratories and then the Valent Group of Companies for more than 30 years. And finally, Eric Ott has served in the role of Field Market Development Specialist for Valent USA for almost 15 years. Prior to his career at Valent, Eric was a researcher at Michigan State University. He earned both his bachelor's degree in agronomy and a master's degree in weed science from Purdue University. So now I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Jill.
Thank you, Robin. This is such a great opportunity for us to be able to talk about and introduce to some our newer fungicide, Excalia, and how it fits within an apple spray program. So thank you. We're really excited to be here. Again, my name is Jill Calabro, and as Robin said, I'm the Fungicide Product Development Manager for Valent USA. And just a little something about myself. I live in Maryland, which is not exactly known for its apple production, but we do have many orchards, mostly on the western half of the state. And I do have a background within orchard systems. When I was at Oregon State University doing work for my dissertation on my PhD, I worked on powdery mildew of sweet cherries. So powdery mildew in orchards is very near and dear to my heart, and I'm very excited to be here to talk about it today. So my role within the webinar is I have the opportunity of introducing the three diseases that we're focused on, which is apple scab, powdery mildew, and rust, all on apple. So I'll introduce a little bit about the diseases, a little bit about the disease cycle, I'll show some pictures, and then I'll give a brief overview of Excalia fungicide. After that, I'll turn it over to my colleagues, Greg Clark and Eric Ott, to provide some more detailed information about the performance data of Excalia and exactly how to use it, and they'll be able to share some of their experiences with you. But first we can talk about apple scab, so let's get to it. Of these three diseases, so again, there's apple scab, powdery mildew, and rust that I'm talking about today. Of the three, they're all very common, but apple scab definitely has the greatest economic impact on apple. Worldwide, apple scab is the most devastating disease on apple, even more so than fire blight. And I think that's just because the conditions are just right for apple scab almost in most of the apple growing areas. In the US, it's interesting. Apple scab is a very big problem in the Midwest and the East. But then in the apple region out in the Pacific Northwest, apple scab is only problematic west of the Cascade Mountain Range, where you have the rainier season and all of the rain and the moisture. East of the Cascades, however, where it's the high desert, arid, drier climate, that's more for powdery mildew, but I'll get into that in just a few slides. See, I'm excited to talk about powdery mildew. I jump into it already. But a little something about the disease cycle of apple scab. This is a disease that overwinters on infected leaf debris. And that's why you see so much information about cultural management strategies focusing on management of that leaf litter and trying to degrade it. And that's an effort to reduce the amount of the primary inoculum, all different strategies for that. And Eric's going to touch on some of more of those issues later in his portion of the webinar. So I'm not going to go into any detail with that now. But apple scab also can overwinter in the bark cracks and fissures on the tree trunk itself. So it's right there in close proximity to all those newly expanding leaves, which are the most susceptible portion of the tree to apple scab. So really in the springtime, right about now in some of the southern growing apple regions, ascospores are released when we have these cool, moist conditions, again, ideal spring conditions. This is a wind-blown, airborne disease. So once those ascospores start popping out of that infected leaf debris or coming out of the bark cracks and fissures of the tree, they're picked up by the wind and blown to the expanding leaves. Once leaves are infected, it's within 2 weeks that a whole new crop of conidia and a whole new crop of spores are produced. So this is a disease that can ramp up fairly quickly and just blow up if the conditions remain ideal for disease development. I've already touched on how the new leaf material is the most susceptible. Immature fruit is also very susceptible, and that's why this disease is so economically damaging to apple, because the fruit can be infected. And then sometimes you may not even see the infections and the effect of an infection until post-harvest conditions, which is extremely unfortunate. So let's get into some of the pictures. So we have 2 pictures here that I'm showing. Let's first start with the smaller picture inset in the upper right corner. That is a great picture showing some of the early apple scab infections. You'll see some leaf distortion. You see a little bit of leaf curling. The leaves aren't quite as flat as they normally should be. But most importantly, I would just draw your attention to those dark brown patches on the leaves that kind of have that velvety appearance. That's typical of an early apple scab infection. So if you see distorted leaves with that dark brown velvety appearance, that's apple scab for sure. And then over time, as the infection matures, you see kind of that bigger picture where you see those leaf spots and a lot of mottling, a lot of brown. You'll see some yellowing a little bit here and there as well. And then that's what it looks like on fruit. Just devastating. You can't sell the fruit. It's just unsaleable and unmarketable. And again, that's why apple scab is so impactful worldwide. All right, so jumping ahead to powdery mildew. Again, another common disease. As I've already touched on, this is a problem in the Pacific Northwest, but only east of the Cascade Mountains. In fact, that area is just a hotbed of powdery mildew activity. Apples is just hammered with powdery mildew out there. And this can be a problem within the east as well, in the Midwest too, but really that area of the Pacific Northwest is just a great area for powdery mildew to grow. And that's because powdery mildew is a pathogen. It's unique in terms of a plant pathogen. It prefers high humidity as opposed to freestanding water. So, and actually, when you think about powdery mildew, well, when you think about all plant pathogens, most of them need rain. They need a rain event, they need freestanding water to cause infection, to grow, to do what they need to do as part of their life cycle. Powdery mildew, that's not the case. And in fact, many of the powdery mildews, freestanding water is actually deleterious to them. Freestanding water can cause some of the powdery mildew spores to actually explode. So it can control powdery mildew in a strange way. But that's why we don't see much powdery mildew west of the Cascades. It's an East Cascade problem. But it does like that high humidity, and it does also prefer the warm temperatures. And the range is anywhere from 65 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit. If it gets too hot, the powdery mildew shuts down. But even 65 to 80 is still quite a range, and that's why powdery mildew can be so problematic. And the other thing I want to say about powdery mildew is it's crop specific. So the powdery mildew on apple is specific to apple. It's different than the one on cherry, for example, or grape, or lilacs, for example, if you want to think about a landscape crop. So control can be a little bit different for all of these powdery mildews. But the disease cycle with powdery mildew, it actually overwinters in infected leaf buds and infected fruit buds. So the infections will occur late in the season, the prior season before, and as those buds are developing. And the mycelium just lingers in that developing bud tissue, so that when those infected buds open and start emerging out those leaves, they're already infected. And that can be very difficult in terms of controlling that primary inoculum. That's a tough issue to start with. So it becomes all that much more important to control uninfected leaf material or clean leaves as they're expanding, because this is another fast-moving disease. similar to apple scab, once it gets going, once it ramps up, it has several life cycles, several disease cycles throughout the season, as long as those weather conditions are met. And fruit can become infected as well. The other thing about powdery mildew that I want to mention is that this is a disease that does not kill a tree outright. It just declines the tree slowly over time. It causes a reduction of vigor. So you think about it, it's of course infecting the leaves. So it reduces the photosynthetic capacity, so the amount of photosynthesis created is reduced. So the overall tree health is reduced. The tree just naturally declines. It's not as able to produce as many fruits. The fruit set is less. Fruit quality is less. Fruit size is less. You name it. The tree can become more susceptible to cold damage in the winter, for example. It's another health issue. So it's just a slow decline of the tree. And then the cycle just repeats all over again at the end of the season when newly forming buds become infected and overwinter and start all over again. So let's take a look at some of the pictures of powdery mildew. So this is a pretty good picture showing a flag shoot of powdery mildew. You could see right in the center, as the name implies, it looks like you've spread white powder on the leaves. And that's how you know I have powdery mildew. It's very specific. There is one other disease that can kind of look like this, but this, when you see this, you know it's powdery mildew. You get leaves that are kind of cupping, and they can have a little bit of distortion with them, but they're cupping, and most of the time the powdery mildew is present on the underside of the leaf surface. In severe populations, that can be present on the upper. But you do get that leaf distortion, and that's why I pulled this picture out to share. As you can see where the powdery mildew infection is along there, that mid vein on the underside of the leaf is highly distorted. But you see the white powder, pretty good indicator there. And then infection can occur on the fruit as well. It's less common, it's much less common, but fruit drop is more common if you have infected fruit. But it can cause that russeting. The fruit just doesn't color as well. The fruit can be misshapen. So you really want to try to keep the fruit clean too, because that would be unmarketable. Okay. And then moving into the last of the big three diseases here that I'm talking about is rust on apple. And I've got cedar apple rust is our primary one that I'll be talking about, and I'll just say that for simplicity's sake. But there are three rust diseases that impact apple. It's cedar apple rust, cedar hawthorn rust, and cedar quince rust. They are all different species of Gymnosporangium. So they are all unique rust species, but they all infect apple, and they're all very difficult to tell them apart. They all look so similar, and they all infect each other. So the cedar apple rust infects hawthorn and quince and serviceberry and crabapple, and et cetera. So as the name implies, there's a cedar component to this disease. Rust diseases can have a very complicated disease cycle. In the case of cedar apple rust, it requires two separate hosts. Again, cedar apple gives you the clues what those are. The primary host in this case is the cedar, or specifically it's red cedar or juniper. White cedar is not susceptible to this at all. White cedar is okay. Red cedar, yes, it can be infected, and juniper. And it has 4 different spore types. So it can become, like I said, it's a complicated disease cycle. And this is a spring disease. Everything starts in the spring with cedar apple rust, especially during high moisture years. And the conditions for infection, especially on the apple host, are pretty well identified. We need freestanding water. So unlike powdery mildew, we have to have a rain event in order to get infection for cedar apple rust. And the temperature range is much more narrow. It's between 56 and 61 degrees Fahrenheit. So mid to upper 50s, low 60s, and a rain event. Those are the conditions you watch out for cedar apple rust infection. And about apple leaves, they're most susceptible when they're 2 to 8 days old. So they get much over a week old, they have some natural resistance going for them. So most of the infections that you have happening are very early on. So the disease cycle, as I said a couple times now, it's a little bit complicated. So it starts every year on the cedar host, the red cedar or juniper, is it overwinters as a gall, and they're very showy. And when you have that right temperature conditions and a rain event, those galls will erupt, and out comes this bright orange ooze of masses of spores. So it's kind of like gelatinous mass of spores. And those become windblown and get blown onto apple and infects the upper surface of apple leaves. And then eventually it goes to infect the lower surface of the leaves. It can infect fruit. And then the leaf infections later in the summer towards early fall create the fourth spore stage, which then becomes windblown and goes back to the cedar host and causes a new gall, and everything starts all over again. So cedar apple rust is very showy. It's a very visual disease, very easily identified. So I will show you a lot of pictures. So this is what a typical gall looks like on red cedar juniper. And you can kind of see those dimples. Those are what erupt during a rain event. You can see this gall kind of mid-ooze as the teleal horns is what they're called, start emerging after a rain event. And that's just nothing but a mass of spores being released. In severe years and the right prime weather conditions, you can have this. You can have just a tree that's just covered. I literally have this picture labeled in my files as teleal horn party. But also, I want to make a note here too about the red cedar host. So those galls, you can look for those. Another way that red cedars are infected, they can be infected on the stems. Twigs and branches can have these swellings on them that can be much more difficult to identify unless they're oozing the spores at springtime of year. You could kind of see where that where the orange ooze is coming from. That little twig there is swollen, and it's just oozing spores, and that can get very significant as well. You can see here the rest, all the spores coming from this. These are large-sized branches. This was what was this, about 10 years ago? We had a really significant rust year in Maryland. I got a lot of good pictures that year. They can be very significant, but they're much more hard to see unless you have the orange ooze. So those are all blowing basidiospores. The spore stage, it lands on the apple leaves, on the apple host, and this is the infection on the upper surface of the apple leaves. You have bright yellow spots with the orange rings. It can be concentric. And then it's about 70 to about 90 days later, depending on which of the rust species it is. I'm jumping ahead of myself. I got one more slide to show you. This is a more severe infection of what the cedar apple rust looks like on the upper surface of the apple leaves. This is a great picture because it really shows that color. You can see this is right after a rain event. So all of those pustules on the upper leaf surface are releasing spores. That's the third spore stage, actually. And I would guess that this year when this picture was taken, that shortly after this, those leaves probably were prematurely dropped. This is a pretty severe infestation, so leaves will just drop and let go. The tree will just let go of those leaves completely and send out a second flush in hopes that they'll be disease-free. And so as you can imagine, that's a great drain on the vigor of the tree. So similar to powdery mildew, cedar apple rust also slowly reduces the vigor and health of the tree. So all of those pustules on the upper leaf surface, eventually after about 70 to 90 days, so later in the summer, will erupt on the underside of the leaf surface. And this is the final spore stage of cedar apple rust. This is the one I always look for at the end of the summer there, as I always run around and poking around under crabapple trees around town looking for those. Those are ethiospores. And those are wind blown back to the cedar host, so the red cedar or the juniper, and where they start the galls or the stem swellings all over again. So the process starts all over again. One thing I do want to show, this is a picture of a quince fruit that's infected. So those are all ethiospores, that final spore stage that are then blown back onto the cedar host. It's more common with cedar quince rust. If you see fruit infected, that's more indicative of cedar quince rust as opposed to cedar apple rust, if you're curious. So that's all I want to share about introducing our three diseases. More importantly, we're also here to talk about Excalia and how it can control these three diseases. And partially one of the reasons it's so effective at controlling these three is due to its systemic nature of imperfluxum. It has some great translaminar activity that's important for controlling these foliar diseases. And translaminar activity just means you spray it, upper leaf surface, then the lower leaf surface is also protected. So some specifics about Excalia. The ingredient is imperfluxum, and it's also called indiflin. That's one of the shorter names that we've given it. It's a FRAC code 7, so it's an SDHI, if you're in the know on that sort of thing. The formulation is a 2.84 SC, and it is registered in all states except for not in California, and we are pending registration in New York. So a little bit more about the mode of action. As I've said, it's a FRAC code 7, so an SDHI, which stands for succinate dehydrogenase inhibitor, which is a fancy way of saying basically it prevents energy production in the fungal cells so that the pathogen cannot grow. That's all it means. SDHIs have been around since about the 1960s, so they've been around for a while. There are several SDHIs out there, but they are not all the same. Of course, they're different in their chemical structure, but they also differ in their disease spectrum. Imperfluxum, in particular, is outstanding for apple scab control. And I'm not saying that just because I'm with Valent. There was a researcher at Cornell who, a couple of years ago, did some research, and she compared all the different SDHIs and reported actually that imperfluxum had the highest activity against mycelial growth of the apple scab pathogen. So it really has great control of apple scab. And it also has good efficacy against rust and powdery mildew too. But as an SDHI, it does have a single site mode of action, which means that fungicide resistance management is especially critical. In the case of apple scab, because so many sprays can be required in a season, up to 10 in some of the Northeast areas I know, QOI resistance has been reported and is known to exist in many apple scab populations out there. However, SDHI, resistance to SDHIs is not been documented yet. It is not known, and we need to make sure that resistance management tools are employed and used by growers so that we maintain this as a tool for use, because it is so effective against apple scab. We would hate to lose it due to fungicide resistance development. So just to wrap up a little bit about Excalia, it has its superior local systemic action, as I've talked about. That translaminar activity is very quick. So again, you spray the upper leaf surface and you have protection on the bottom, the underside of the leaf surface as well. And that's important for all three of these foliar diseases. I've touched on the excellent control, the efficacy against apple scab that imperfluxum has. We've seen some early curative activity with that as well, that I think Greg will touch on. And what's important about apple scab is it attacks the pathogen at two key points within its life cycle. It prevents spore germination and prevents mycelial growth. So that is all the slides that I have. So with that, I am going to turn it over to my colleague, Greg Clark, who is Valent's Field Market Development Specialist in the Northeast. And Greg has a great amount of experience with Excalia on apple. So Greg, you are up.
Thanks, Jill. So my section of the talk will be talking about some of this evidence for the benefits that Jill was just talking about, and then we will look at how those benefits have translated into really good field performance from Excalia. So to start, though, I want to just give some context for Excalia among other apple fungicides. So this table summarizes a lot of that. You can see the brands on the left, and then the FRAC group designations for each of these. You can see the active ingredients, the diseases that are labeled, the use rates, number of applications per season, and then the PHI. I just want to highlight for Excalia that it is a single active ingredient material, like Jill just said, so may fit a little better in your resistance management program as a solo AI rather than a combination kind of product. And also, Eric will talk more about this in his section of the talk, but I did want to highlight the relatively low use rate, the number of applications per season, and the fact that the last application is at petal fall. So in the data that I'll be showing you here briefly, Excalia is generally tested in 2 applications, the first being at pink, and then the second application being at petal fall. So just be on the lookout for that, and I wanted to highlight that here. Eric will give you more detail coming. All right, and then also wanted to show you the sort of relative efficacy of the apple fungicides that you're probably familiar with. So again, on the left, the various brands, the FRAC groupings, you can see that Excalia is one among several excellent scab materials. And you'll see with respect to powdery mildew, across the group of fungicides, there's more variability here, and Excalia is sort of right in the middle of the pack on this. All right, so let's get started on some of the benefits that Jill was talking about. And the first, we'll talk about this local systemic activity, the translaminar activity. So in a greenhouse test, what they did is they took small amounts of each of these materials and applied it to the base of the leaves. So look at the pictures on the bottom, and you can see that green circle. So they would put little bits of each of these materials on the base of the leaves, and then leave them alone for about 4 days. They would grow to see where the material ended up. And so the next slide shows the results of that. I want to draw your attention first to the little inset picture on the right. So this is radio-labeled Excalia, and it's just showing you over the course of 4 days how it moves from that small place at the base of the leaf where it was applied, how it, over 4 days, then moved across the whole leaf surface, as Jill had mentioned. It's locally systemic and translaminar. And so the results of this are in the graph there that you're seeing. So after the 4 days, then they sprayed apple scab spores over all of the leaves, and here's the result. And that is that the Excalia provided 88% control of scab when it's used this way compared to some of the other materials. A real high performer here, just illustrating this really good systemic activity and how this material moves around. This has real practical implications here, of course, because not all spray applications in the field are perfect. So data like this give you confidence to know that if you're doing a decent job out there with spraying and your timing and your application equipment and things like that, Excalia will move around the leaf surface locally systemic in that way to get where it needs to be to give you maximum protection against scab and mildew and rust. The next benefit that we'll talk about that Jill mentioned was this high inherent activity that Excalia has against apple scab. So what you're looking at here in this graph is something called an EC50, or the effective control parameter. And in this kind of graph, the lower number, the better. That's indicating that a very small amount of material is needed to give equivalent control. So all of these materials compared to one another, you can see that Excalia has some of the lowest numbers here, meaning a little bit goes a long way. So this, again, is evidence that you've got a material here that's very powerful, is very effective in small doses. The next thing we want to highlight is this post-infection activity. And in this kind of greenhouse test, Excalia is applied 4 days after infection. So they spray all these trees with scab spores and then come and put the various spray materials on after 4 days. And then you're looking for what sort of effects did they have. And in this case, the untreated trees got to about 84% of infection of the area of the leaf surface. And this graph indicates that Excalia provided, it's a little over 99% control compared to the untreated. Right up there too is Aprovia, and then compared to the other materials, just indicating that even after 4 days of an active infection, you can have very significant impacts to control this disease. And again, this has all kinds of practical implications. Now, we don't, you would never recommend to use a fungicide this way, of course, but it does give you peace of mind that during the very dynamic primary scab season, when you have weather fronts coming in and out, you have scab infection periods firing off, it's difficult to get into the field, you've got wind, you've got other factors that are keeping you from, being perfectly timed. These kinds of results in this graph can give you confidence that you've got a material that if you're out there doing the best you can, you've got a material that's working with you to give you the best possible control, even after the fact. Okay, so that's a lot of fancy lab data. So what does that mean for field performance? So what we'll do now is review some of the field performance data from the eastern U.S. and then the Pacific Northwest. So here in the east, let's look at scab, mildew, and rust. In this case, we're looking at a graph over multiple field trials, multiple years, just sort of the broadest view possible. And you can see that Excalia is giving excellent control of fruit scab and leaf scab compared to some of the other materials, all doing very well compared to the untreated. And, as typical, untreated trees, lots of scabby apples here, and in our experience, Excalia has resulted in very, very clean fruit out to the end of the season. Now we're going to drill into some individual trials just so you can see that there's more behind just the general overview there. So this was work in Pennsylvania by Dr. Carrie Peter. You're looking here, green bar is Excalia compared to Aprovia and Maravon across these different parameters. So you have incidence of leaf scab all the way to the left, then fruit scab, leaf rust, and then incidence of powdery mildew all the way to the right. And the point here is just that Excalia is doing a great job in that typical program that I mentioned earlier on, where Excalia is applied at pink and then petal fall, and then there's another, a whole scab program is built around that, including all the cover sprays. So you're looking at the end of season results here. So Excalia is doing a great job, very comparable to other materials. This is some work from Western New York showing Excalia in a Manzate Pro Stick kind of program background. Again, excellent results in reducing incidence of fruit and leaf scab. This was work by Dr. Carrie Cox at Cornell. Again, very, very good control of primary leaf scab, and the fruit scab results there out to the right to show you how powerful Excalia can be to keep fruit scab to an absolute minimum. And then finally for scab, here's some work from Michigan State. Again, Excalia in a Manzate Pro Stick kind of program, doing a great job. Now thinking about powdery mildew in the east, this is another summary slide over multiple years, multiple trials. In green there, Excalia right in there with the pack for mildew control, doing a good job. Like Jill said, these are excellent scab materials. Mildew, they're good. All right, now some years we've had an opportunity to see how Excalia performs on cedar apple rust. Here's some work from Keith Yoder in Virginia, at Virginia Tech, in a very severe rust year, and you can see Excalia doing a great job in keeping the percent infected leaves very, very low, and you can see that compared to some of the other materials. In another year, here's the two different rates of Excalia, 3 and 4 ounces per acre, again in the typical program of pink and then petal fall with other things built around it. Again, keeping leaf scab or leaf rust to a minimum. All right, so that's the eastern U.S. Now let's think about performance out in the Pacific Northwest. As Jill mentioned, scab is prevalent west of the Cascades, so let's look at that. So here's a single site there looking at 3 or 4 ounces of Excalia compared to some grower standards. Good control of apple scab out there. Now powdery mildew, which as Jill said, is really the driver disease in the Pacific Northwest. And this is from a single trial results you're looking at here. So here's Excalia in a Maravon and TopGuard program compared to some other programs, giving very, very good reductions in the severity of powdery mildew in this particular study. And again, typical pictures, lots of mildew in the untreated. Excalia treated trees really always look just fantastic. Here's some multi-year, studies across several years, just showing a couple of different ways in which Excalia was studied out there. So look at the first 2 bars on the left, where here the program was starting at green tip, and then the second application at petal fall at 3 and 4 ounces. Then when you go to the 3rd and 4th bar, this is, as I was showing you from the east, a pink and petal fall timing for 3 and 4. Again, all of these different ways to use Excalia at these 2 different rates, giving very comparable control to the grower standards there. All right, so that's really the end of my section here. What I hope I've done is given you some of the evidence for the benefits, this locally systemic activity, the translaminar movement of Excalia being very good, the high inherent activity, in other words, a little bit of this material goes a long way and is very, very effective, and the post-infection activity, giving you some peace of mind during the primary scab season. And all of this has translated really nicely into some excellent field performance, both east and west coast on scab, mildew, and rust. So now I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Eric Ott, who will give you some details about how to use Excalia and some best practices. Eric?
Thank you, Greg. So we will go through some of the basics on how to use Excalia fungicide in apples. As Greg mentioned, the Excalia use rate is relatively low. The use rate is between 3 to 4 fluid ounces per acre, with a maximum of total of 8 fluid ounces per acre per year. We're limited to no more than 2 applications per year with a retreatment interval of 10 days. Excalia can be used between the growth stages of green tip and petal fall. Earlier applications will not have an effect on the pathogens, and applications beyond petal fall may have elevated fungicide residues at harvest. We do recommend 100 gallons of water per acre as a carrier volume to ensure good coverage. While lower volumes of water can be used, we have observed our best results with good coverage. We recommend the use of an adjuvant in most applications and is required when targeting powdery mildew. And the key washout here, the only adjuvant that we really want to wash out for is not using a crop oil concentrate. Excalia fungicide has a re-entry restricted interval of 12 hours. And as mentioned earlier, the pre-harvest interval is not to apply Excalia after petal fall. Excalia has a rain fastness of 2 hours. When Excalia is used according to the label, residues do not exceed the default MRL of 0.01 parts per million. As mentioned on a previous slide, Excalia fungicide can be applied between green tip and petal fall, which is a very important time for primary apple scab as well as powdery mildew management. And just to give you a forecast of what's coming, I live in central Indiana, and I have several apple trees in my backyard, and they are still all dormant or at silver tips. So we're all good still here. So hopefully this cool weather continues and pushes that off a little longer. Some best practices for Excalia fungicide use. For resistance management, we do not want to tank mix with other FRAC 7 fungicides or other SDHI fungicides. Also, to reduce the risk of fungicide resistance to SDHI fungicides, Excalia should be used preventively and early in the disease outbreak. SDHI fungicides should be used only 3 to 4 times per year, with at the most 2 consecutive applications. And SDHI fungicides should be mixed with fungicides with other effective modes of action, like Captan. Excalia should not be applied within 50 feet of any freshwater lake, pond, river, stream, or wetland. And currently, apples are the only fruit that Excalia fungicide is registered. We have tested Excalia on several different economically important apple varieties, including Gala and Honeycrisp. As you can see, crop safety has been tested at twice the field use rate on several of these varieties, highlighted in green, with no observed phytotoxicity on the fruit or the leaves. So MRLs. The MRL for Excalia fungicide has been set to the default, which is 0.1 parts per million in the U.S. and the 2 major importers of U.S. apples, Canada and Mexico. However, when Excalia fungicide is applied per the label, which means no later than petal fall, no detectable residues are measured at harvest. Some additional IPM principles to think about in managing apple scab and powdery mildew include proper pruning to allow for better airflow, the use of resistant cultivars, sanitation with leaf litter management, following regionally focused disease prediction models like NUA and RIMPRO, and keep informed with up-to-date disease management guidelines through local university extension. And as always, well-timed fungicide applications with well-calibrated equipment will help ensure proper placement, allow for the best efficacy against the target pathogens. So to wrap things up, Excalia fungicide has excellent locally systemic action, allowing for leaf uptake and distribution for complete protection. Translaminar movement of Excalia provides protection for the entire leaf against scab, powdery mildew, and rust. Excalia can provide excellent control of apple scab, even post-infection, and attacks the scab pathogen at 2 key points in its life cycle: spore germination and mycelia growth. And at that, thank you.
Jill, we have a couple of questions for you to start with, and if you have not already submitted a question, please go ahead and do so. Jill, the first couple are directed at you. If Excalia stops mycelial growth, does that mean it keeps the fungus from infecting the leaf, or does it mean it keeps the infection from progressing?
That's a really great question. Excalia definitely stops the spread of the fungus, but it can also prevent the germination and infection process as well. So it can work at both. It works at both of those critical points within the life cycle of the disease.
Okay. All right. Good. And then someone would like to know when you anticipate Excalia will be registered in New York. Is that coming soon?
No. Yeah, that's another question. We don't have an estimated timeline for New York. I know it has been submitted. We're just waiting on processing. We hope that it will be soon.
Okay. All right, we have a listener who I'm going to turn this question over to Greg. What would be a sample spray program using Excalia as far as timing and tank mix partners?
Yeah, so most of our testing has been done with, as I was mentioning, Excalia at pink, and then often we've had like Inspire Super at bloom, and then Excalia again at petal fall, and then usually people are into the cover sprays. So really, it's like a good choice to use during the primary scab season. As Jill and everybody has been saying, it's very powerful against apple scab, and primary season is the time to get on top of this disease, and it seems to fit really well at those two timings, so pink and petal fall, and then look to your regional extension folks or your local consultants to help you make good choices for your region with respect to fungicide rotation, different frac groups at your other points of spray timings is what I'm trying to say. So. Okay.
And I've got two questions. One will probably be a very easy one to answer, so I'm going to combine it with another. The first question is it organic, or is there an organic formulation? And then the second one is, how does Excalia compare to Captan?
Right, it's not organic. This is not an organic formulation. And then how it compares to Captan. Captan is one of those fungicides that's a broad spectrum material. So it's in its own frac grouping, and it's considered like a broad spectrum sort of material. And compare that to what you heard from Jill, where Excalia is a very specific type of material, an SDHI, and so it has its own very, very tight mode of action. So it's very different from Captan. Captan being broad spectrum, whereas Excalia is sort of like a very, very specific, site specific with respect to the fungus. So you can compare it this way: Captan is like a shotgun, Excalia is more like a rifle.
Okay. Okay, Eric, you are on the hook next. Can you elaborate on compatible scab tank mixes and what their function is versus what Excalia does?
Yes, so I'll break that up into a couple of answers. So, just from a basic tank mix statement is that we have tested a lot of the many common tank mixes that are used during this time, and even through the kitchen sink at it, just to see if we would induce any phytotoxicity, and we haven't observed that yet, but just a couple of watch outs is, one, to stay away from COC adjuvants, and two, do the jar testing and physical compatibility, and that you would typically do for physical compatibility type testing. So to then answer specifically the question, can you elaborate on the compatibility scab tank mixes? So I know in trials that have been conducted in the past, as Greg mentioned, Captan, I know I've had Manzate type of products, as well as Roper, not to exclude anyone, but we've tested several things just for the better control of those spores.
Okay. All right. Next question is also for you, Eric. Is Excalia registered on other tree fruit crops, or is it just apples?
So currently, Excalia is only registered on apples, not on pears.
Do you know if they're going to be pursuing more crops, or is that still kind of unknown yet?
Yeah. Yeah, so we are currently testing Excalia on pear right now. So.
Okay. All right, good. All right, Joe, I'm going to direct this back to you. What makes Escalia different from other SDHI fungicides?
Well, Excalia is part of the third generation or next generation of SDHIs, that class. So it's a newer SDHI. What makes it unique and different from the others, we've touched on a little bit in terms of its spectrum of activity. As Greg did a great job, it's not as broad spectrum. It is very specific about the pathogens that it controls. It's so great against apple scab and has good efficacy against rust and powdery mildew too. But it has activity against other diseases as well, rhizoctonia being key, sclerotium, we see activity there. One of the other things that I'll add in terms of what makes it unique is how effective it is. And Greg talked a lot about the high inherent activity. And you can really see that in terms of the rates that are used of Excalia. It's so active at such low rates.
Okay. Yeah, that's always nice to not have to use high rates of it. It's a definite advantage. Okay, Greg, can you address how long Escalia lasts? Does it stay on the leaves very long, or does it stay in the plant very long?
Yeah, it stays in the plant, we think probably 10 to 14 days, but probably the more important thing to think about here is that, as Jill mentioned, as she covered the biology of these diseases, new tissue, newly growing, newly unfolding leaves are the most susceptible to apple scab in particular here, and those will be unprotected as they unfurl. So you really need to be thinking carefully about your timing of your whole fungicide program to make sure that you don't have unprotected tissue. So even though Excalia will probably persist within the leaves that had the application for 10 days or so, it's this material, even though it's locally systemic and it'll move through that leaf really well, it's not like it gets into the vascular system and will protect the newly unfolding leaves. So yeah, technically probably 10 to 14 days or 10 to 12 days or something for the leaves that were treated, but really you got to be thinking about protecting the newly expanding leaves as you go through the season like that.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Will Valent secure more MRLs for Escalia? And if so, when?
In regards to the MRLs, one of the, I guess, nicer features of how we've worked the label for Excalia is the applications must end by petal fall. And that was in part by design, and that we are looking to get no residues so that MRLs are a non-issue.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right, good. And then let's see. I'm going to make sure, see what other questions are. Oh, there's a couple more questions coming in here. Have you noticed any issues with fruit finish? That could either be Jill or Greg.
No, we haven't. Like Eric was saying, we've really tested this and, tried to make things happen, and it's really been very, we've had no trouble with fruit finish.
Okay. All right, and Greg, this one's for you. It's kind of a two-part question. Escalia availability, is it widely available, limited available? Is it being just reduced on a special basis? Maybe you can talk about that a little bit.
Right, you should be able to find it through normal distribution, except in New York State. But yeah, okay. You should be able to find this through your normal distribution channels.
Okay. And the second part of that question is about the price. They acknowledge superior product equals superior pricing, but they're kind of wanting to know where it falls relative to maybe competitor products. Right there, you'd have to check again with your local distribution
partner to see. We think it's competitive with other materials like it, but that's very much a locally controlled kind of thing with your distributor partner.
Okay. All right, our next question here, and it's also for Greg. 100 gallons per acre isn't practical in my operation. Isn't that the runoff rate? And then they said, is there a minimum spray volume where the product is still effective?
Yeah, I think we mentioned the 100 gallons per acre just as a reference point. But the point is getting good coverage. So if you're able to get good coverage at 50 gallons per acre because of the way you're training your trees and your orchard set up, that's fine. It's just I guess when we wrote the label and give our recommendations, we want people to think about really good coverage. So you know your trees best, you know your equipment best. You feel like you're getting excellent coverage at 50, 75 gallons per acre. Just make sure you've got Excalia at the right rate per acre, and you should be good to go.
Okay. All right, Jill, we'll go back to you. Is Excalia application effectiveness dependent on temperature or any other environmental factor? That's a good question.
That is a good question. We haven't seen much in the way of impact of environmental conditions, but what I would say is target when the disease. I mean, most important is to focus on what the disease is doing. Eric talked about following the disease prediction models. We got to be focused on that. And of course, actually, I should say, in terms of environmental conditions, watch out for rainfall. We do have a rain fastness issue, not an issue, but we do have a range there. So don't apply it an hour before you're expecting a deluge, for example. Take a look at the label and make sure you're following all those guidelines, but really targeting the disease timing is best.
Okay. All right, Eric, our next question is, would you recommend a surfactant to be used with Excalia?
Yes. Is this better? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
All right, good. Yes. The short answer is yes. And from the adjuvant side of things, stick with what you're familiar with. The only watch out here with Excalia would be do not use with COC. And we do recommend, the label recommends using, I would use a surfactant period, and it's required when targeting powdery mildew.
Okay. All right, good.
I'll add to that.
Go ahead.
And I think, remember, Eric, we've also seen that organosilicones are particularly good partners if powdery mildew is your target. So that would be the only thing I would add there.
Okay. All right, I'm going to ask one more question here to Greg, and it's, what is the Excalibur container size?
Oh, it's in gallons.
Okay. All right, well then I'm going to wrap up the webinar now, and as a reminder, an on-demand version of it will be archived in the next few hours, and you can access it using the same link that you used today. And you can also find the link at growingproduce.com/webinars. So I want to thank, of course, our audience and our speakers and Valent USA for making this webinar possible. So thank you and have a great day.